The first time it happened was Christmas Eve, 1965. A young couple walked into Martinelli's, a small Italian restaurant on a quiet street in Los Angeles. They were newlyweds, barely making ends meet. He was a factory worker. She was a secretary. They had saved for weeks to afford this one special dinner, their first Christmas Eve as husband and wife. They ordered carefully, watching the prices, calculating in their heads. Spaghetti and meatballs for him, chicken parmigiana for her. One glass of wine to share. No dessert. They couldn't afford it. When the meal was over, they asked for the check. The waiter, a young Italian man named Marco, smiled and shook his head. "There is no check, signore." "What do you mean?" "Your dinner has been paid for. By a friend." The couple looked around the restaurant, confused. They didn't know anyone here. They didn't have friends who could afford to buy them dinner. "Who?" the husband asked. "Who paid?" Marco shrugged. "A friend of the restaurant. He wishes to remain anonymous. He only asks that you enjoy your meal and have a Merry Christmas." The couple left that night bewildered but grateful. They never found out who had paid for their dinner. They assumed it was a one-time thing, a random act of kindness from a wealthy stranger. They had no idea that the same thing was happening to every single person who walked into Martinelli's that night. From 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, 1965, 47 people ate dinner at Martinelli's. Every single one of them had their bill paid by the same anonymous benefactor. None of them ever found out who it was. And it was only the beginning. Martinelli's was not a famous restaurant. It wasn't mentioned in travel guides or reviewed by food critics. It was a small, family-owned place in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of restaurant where the owner knew your name and the recipes hadn't changed in 50 years. Giuseppe Martinelli had opened it in 1932, bringing his mother's recipes from Naples. His son Antonio took over in 1958. The restaurant seated maybe 60 people, with red checkered tablecloths and candles in old Chianti bottles. The walls were covered with photographs of Italy and signed pictures of minor celebrities who had eaten there over the years. It was the kind of place where you went when you wanted to feel at home. On Christmas Eve 1965, Antonio Martinelli received an unusual visitor. It was early morning, around 7 a.m. The restaurant didn't open until 5 p.m., but Antonio was there preparing for the evening rush. Christmas Eve was always busy, families celebrating, couples on dates, lonely people looking for somewhere warm to spend the holiday. There was a knock on the back door. Antonio opened it to find a man standing in the alley. He was well-dressed, wearing an expensive coat and hat. His face was partially hidden by the early morning shadows, but something about him seemed familiar. "Can I help you?" Antonio asked. "You're Antonio Martinelli?" "Yes." The man reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to Antonio. "This is for tonight, for Christmas Eve dinner. I want to pay for everyone who comes in." Antonio looked at the envelope, confused. "Everyone?" "Everyone, from when you open until when you close. Whatever they order, appetizers, wine, dessert, everything. I want it all paid for." Antonio opened the envelope. Inside was a check. A very large check. More money than the restaurant made in a typical month. "I don't understand," Antonio said. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The man smiled, a familiar smile, though Antonio couldn't quite place it. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone on Christmas. And I know what it means to have someone show you kindness when you don't expect it. But this is too much. I can't accept." "You're not accepting anything. I'm paying for dinner. That's all. If there's money left over, keep it for your family. Consider it a Christmas bonus." Antonio stared at the check, then at the man. "Can I at least know your name, so I can thank you properly?" The man shook his head. "No names. And don't tell the customers who paid. Just tell them it's from a friend. Can you do that for me?" Antonio nodded slowly. "Yes, I can do that." "Good." The man turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. The people who come in tonight, they're going to be all kinds of people. Rich, poor, families, couples, people eating alone. I don't want you to treat them any differently. Everyone gets the same gift. Everyone deserves to feel special on Christmas Eve. I understand. The man walked away down the alley. Antonio watched him go, still holding the envelope, still trying to figure out what had just happened. It wasn't until later that night, when Antonio saw the man's photograph on the wall of his own restaurant, that he realized who had visited him that morning. Dean Martin, the king of cool, the famous singer and actor, the man whose records played on the radio and whose movies filled the theaters. Dean Martin had paid for Christmas Eve dinner at Martinelli's. Antonio kept his word. He didn't tell anyone, not his wife, not his children, not the customers who asked who had paid for their meals. He just smiled and said, "A friend of the restaurant." He assumed it was a one-time thing, a generous gesture from a wealthy celebrity who had too much money and a soft spot for Italian food. He was wrong. The next year, on Christmas Eve morning, 1966, there was another knock on the back door. Dean Martin was standing in the alley holding an envelope. "Same as last year," Dean said. "Everyone who comes in tonight, whatever they want." Antonio took the envelope. "Mr. Martin, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything, and don't call me Mr. Martin. If anyone asks, you don't know who I am." "But why? Why are you doing this?" Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone did it for me once, a long time ago, and I never got to thank them." He walked away before Antonio could ask anything else. The same thing happened in 1967, and 1968, and 1969. Every year, without fail, Dean Martin appeared at the back door of Martinelli's on Christmas Eve morning. Every year, he left an envelope with enough money to cover every meal served that night. Every year, he asked Antonio to keep his identity secret. "Just tell them it's from a friend." For 30 years, this ritual continued. 30 Christmases, 30 envelopes, thousands of strangers who ate dinner at Martinelli's on Christmas Eve, never knowing that Dean Martin had paid for their meal. Marco Benedetti started working at Martinelli's in 1971. He was 19 years old, fresh off the boat from Sicily, barely speaking English. Antonio hired him as a busboy, then promoted him to waiter when he proved himself reliable. Marco noticed the Christmas Eve tradition immediately. His first Christmas at the restaurant, he was confused when customers kept asking for their checks, and he had to tell them the meal was already paid for. He asked Antonio about it. "Don't ask questions," Antonio said. "Just tell them it's from a friend." "But who pays for all of this?" Antonio looked at him seriously. "Marco, I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to keep it secret for as long as you work here. Can you do that?" Marco nodded. "Every Christmas Eve, a man comes to this restaurant. A famous man. He pays for everyone's dinner. He doesn't want anyone to know. If you tell anyone at all, you're fired. Understand?" "Yes, Mr. Martinelli. I understand." "Good. Now get back to work." Marco kept the secret. For the next 24 years, he watched the same ritual unfold every Christmas Eve. He watched Dean Martin's envelopes arrive. He watched strangers receive the gift of a free meal. He watched their faces light up with confusion and gratitude. And he watched Dean Martin himself, on the rare occasions when the singer would slip into the restaurant on Christmas Eve night. Dean never sat at a table. He never ordered food. He would come in through the back door, stand in the kitchen doorway, and watch the dining room for a few minutes. He would watch the families laughing, the couples holding hands, the lonely people savoring their meals. He would watch them all, with an expression that Marco could never quite read. Then he would leave, as quietly as he had come. Marco wanted to ask him why. Why did he do this, year after year? Why did he spend thousands of dollars on strangers? Why did he stand in the kitchen doorway and watch them eat, like a ghost observing the living? But Marco never asked. He had promised to keep the secret, and he kept it. The tradition almost ended in 1987. That was the year Dean Martin's son, Dino Jr., died in a plane crash. The news was everywhere. The famous singer's boy, killed in a military training accident, his body scattered across a mountainside in California. Antonio didn't expect to see Dean that Christmas. How could he? The man had just lost his son. He was grieving, broken, barely appearing in public. Surely he wouldn't come to the restaurant this year. But on Christmas Eve morning, 1987, there was a knock on the back door. Dean Martin was standing in the alley. He looked 20 years older than he had the year before. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as he held out the envelope. "Same as always," Dean said. His voice was barely a whisper. Antonio took the envelope. He didn't know what to say. What could you say to a man who had just buried his child? "Mr. Martin, Dean, you don't have to do this. Not this year. Everyone would understand." Dean shook his head. "Especially this year. This year more than any other." "But why?" Dean was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "Because there are people out there who are spending Christmas alone. People who have lost someone. People who are hurting. And for one night, I want them to feel like someone cares. I want them to feel like they're not invisible." Tears were streaming down his face now. "My boy is gone. I can't bring him back. I can't do anything to change what happened. But I can do this. I can give people one night where they don't have to worry about money. One night where someone is thinking about them." He wiped his eyes. "It's not much. It doesn't fix anything. But it's something. And right now, something is all I have." Antonio didn't say anything. He just reached out and hugged Dean Martin. This broken man, this grieving father, standing in an alley on Christmas Eve morning, trying to give away what he couldn't keep. They stood there for a long time, two men holding each other, while the early morning traffic hummed in the distance. The tradition continued. 1988, 1989, 1990. Every year Dean came. Every year the envelope appeared. Every year strangers ate dinner at Martinelli's without knowing who had paid. But Dean was fading. Marco could see it. Each year Dean looked thinner, weaker, more tired. The man who had once radiated charm and energy now moved like a shadow. His visits to the kitchen doorway became shorter. His envelope deliveries became quicker. It was as if he was racing against time, trying to complete the ritual before something caught up with him. In 1994, Dean came to the restaurant for the last time. It was Christmas Eve morning, as always. But this time, when Antonio opened the back door, Dean could barely stand. He was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, clutching the envelope in his shaking hand. "Dean, you should be home. You should be resting." "I'll rest soon enough." Dean held out the envelope. "Same as always." Antonio took it. "Dean, how many years has it been?" Dean thought about it. 30. This is 30 years. 30 years. "Do you know how many people you've fed? How many families?" "I don't count." "I do. I've kept records. Over 6,000 people, Dean. 6,000 strangers who had Christmas dinner because of you." Dean smiled weakly. "That's a nice number." "It's more than nice. It's a miracle. You've been performing a miracle for 30 years and no one knows. That's the way I want it." "But why? Why don't you want people to know? You could have gotten so much publicity, so much praise. Why keep it secret?" Dean leaned against the doorframe. For a moment, Antonio thought he might collapse. "Because it's not about me," Dean said. "It was never about me. It's about them. The people eating dinner. The moment they find out that Dean Martin paid for their meal, it becomes about Dean Martin. It becomes a story they tell at parties. Guess what happened to me once? Dean Martin bought me dinner. And that's fine, but that's not the gift." He took a breath. "The gift is the mystery. The gift is not knowing who cared enough to do this for you. The gift is believing that somewhere out there are good people who help strangers for no reason. That's what I want them to feel. Not Dean Martin is generous, but The world is kind. Antonio was crying now. He didn't bother to hide it. Will you come back next year? Dean didn't answer. He just patted Antonio on the shoulder, turned, and walked slowly down the alley. Antonio watched him go, knowing somehow that he was watching Dean Martin leave for the last time. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. The news broke that morning, interrupting holiday broadcasts across the country. The King of Cool was gone, passing peacefully in his sleep at his Beverly Hills home. He was 78 years old. Antonio Martinelli heard the news and wept. Not for the celebrity the world had lost, but for the man who had knocked on his back door every Christmas Eve for 30 years. The man who had fed 6,000 strangers and never asked for a single thank you. That Christmas Eve, hours before Dean died, there was no knock on the back door. For the first time in 30 years, the tradition was broken. Antonio considered paying for the dinners himself, using his own savings to continue what Dean had started. But it felt wrong. This was Dean's gift, not his. To continue it would be to take something that didn't belong to him. So that night, for the first time since 1965, the customers at Martinelli's paid for their own meals. None of them knew what they had missed. None of them knew that for 3 decades they would have eaten for free. None of them knew that a tradition had ended, that a secret angel had died, that the world had become a little less kind. Marco Benedetti kept the secret for 6 more years. In 2001, Martinelli's closed its doors for good. Antonio had died in 1998, and his children had no interest in running the restaurant. The building was sold to a developer who planned to tear it down and build condominiums. On the last night the restaurant was open, a local newspaper sent a reporter to write a story about the closing. The reporter interviewed the staff, asking about their memories, their favorite customers, their best stories. Marco Benedetti was 78 years old. He had worked at Martinelli's for 30 years. He had kept Dean Martin's secret for all of them, but now the restaurant was closing. Antonio was dead. Dean was dead. What was the point of keeping a secret when everyone who had made you promise was gone? The reporter asked Marco if he had any special memories from his time at Martinelli's. Marco thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone. I've kept this secret for 30 years, but I think it's time for people to know." He told the reporter about Dean Martin, about the Christmas Eve tradition, about 30 years of anonymous generosity, about 6,000 strangers who never knew who had bought them dinner. The reporter was skeptical at first. It sounded too good to be true. Dean Martin secretly paying for strangers' meals for 30 years? Where was the proof? Marco had proof. Antonio had kept meticulous records, every envelope, every check, every year documented in a ledger that he stored in the restaurant's safe. Marco retrieved the ledger and showed it to the reporter. 30 years of checks, all signed by Dean Martin, all with the same note in the memo line: "For everyone who's alone tonight." The story ran on New Year's Day, 2002. Dean Martin's secret Christmas gift, 30 years, 6,000 strangers, and the tradition nobody knew about. The response was overwhelming. People who had eaten at Martinelli's on Christmas Eve over the years came forward, sharing their memories. The young couple from 1965, now in their 60s, read the article and finally learned who had paid for their first Christmas dinner as newlyweds. "We talked about that night for years," the wife said in an interview. "We always wondered who did it. We assumed it was some random rich person who happened to be in the restaurant. We never imagined it was Dean Martin. We never imagined anyone would do something like that for strangers, year after year, for 30 years. Families wrote letters to the newspaper, describing how much the free dinner had meant to them. Single mothers who had been struggling to afford Christmas for their children. Elderly widowers eating alone for the first time after losing their wives. College students far from home, homesick and broke. All of them had walked into Martinelli's on Christmas Eve and walked out feeling like someone cared. None of them had ever known who that someone was. Until now. The story spread. Newspapers picked it up. Television shows mentioned it. Dean Martin, already beloved as a singer and entertainer, became something more, a symbol of quiet generosity, of kindness without credit, of giving without expecting anything in return. But the question everyone asked was, why? Why did Dean Martin spend 30 years secretly feeding strangers on Christmas Eve? Marco Benedetti knew the answer. In 1976, 11 years into the tradition, Dean had arrived at the restaurant not in the morning but late at night after the dinner service was over. He was drunk, actually drunk, not the fake drunk he played on stage, and he wanted to talk. Antonio was gone for the night. Marco was alone cleaning up. Dean sat at the bar and started talking. "Do you want to know why I do this?" Dean asked. Marco nodded. "Christmas 1944. I was 27 years old. I was nobody, just a kid from Ohio trying to make it as a singer. I had no money, no prospects, no family nearby. I was completely alone." Dean poured himself a drink. "I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I couldn't afford food. I was walking down the street on Christmas Eve looking in restaurant windows, watching other people eat, feeling sorry for myself." He took a long sip. "There was this little Italian place on the corner. Reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen back in Steubenville. I stood outside for a while just looking in. I must have looked pathetic, because the owner came out and asked if I was okay." Dean's eyes were distant, lost in the memory. "I told him I was fine. I was lying, obviously. He could see I was starving. He brought me inside, sat me down, and brought me the biggest plate of pasta I'd ever seen. Meatballs, bread, wine, everything. I ate like I hadn't eaten in weeks, because I hadn't." He paused. "When I asked for the check, he said it was paid for. I asked who paid. He said a customer had seen me through the window and asked to cover my meal, anonymously. No name, no explanation. Just kindness." Dean wiped his eyes. "I never found out who it was. I spent years trying to figure it out. But they never came forward. They just gave me that gift and disappeared." He looked at Marco. "That meal saved my life, not just because I was hungry, but because I was ready to give up. I was done. I thought the world was cold and cruel and there was no point in trying anymore. And then this stranger, this person I never met, whose name I never learned, showed me that I was wrong. Showed me that there was still kindness in the world, still people who cared about strangers." Dean finished his drink. "I made a promise to myself that night. If I ever made it, if I ever had money, I would do the same thing for other people. I would find people who were alone on Christmas and show them that someone cared." He stood up to leave. "That's why I do this. Because someone did it for me, and I never got to thank them. So instead I thank them by doing it for others. 30 years, 60 years, 100 years. It doesn't matter. I'll keep doing it until I die." Marco never told anyone that story. Not while Dean was alive. Not while Antonio was alive. He kept it locked away, along with all the other secrets of Martinelli's. But in 2001, when the reporter came asking questions, Marco decided it was time. The world needed to know. Not just that Dean Martin had been generous, but why. Not just what he did, but what had been done to him. The chain of kindness that stretched from an anonymous stranger in 1944 to 6,000 strangers over 30 years. That's what Dean wanted people to understand, Marco told the reporter. It's not about one rich man buying dinner. It's about passing it on. Someone helped Dean when he was nobody. Dean helped thousands of people when he was somebody. And maybe some of those people will help others. That's how the world gets better. One act of kindness at a time. The reporter published Marco's story. It became the most shared article the newspaper had ever run. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. People started their own traditions. Restaurants around the country began offering Dean Martin Christmas promotions, where anonymous donors would pay for strangers' meals on Christmas Eve. Churches organized Secret Santa programs inspired by Dean's example. Strangers started paying for each other's groceries, their coffee, their gas, small acts of anonymous kindness that rippled outward from one man's 30-year commitment. Dean Martin had wanted to remain anonymous. He had wanted the gift to be about the recipients, not about himself. In a way, he succeeded. Because the legacy of his Christmas tradition wasn't Dean Martin was generous. It was anyone can be generous. Anyone can change a stranger's life. Anyone can break the chain of loneliness and show someone that they matter. That was the real gift. Not the food. Not the money. The permission to believe in human kindness. Marco Benedetti died in 2008. He was 85 years old. In his final interview, given just weeks before his death, he was asked what he wanted people to remember about his time at Martinelli's. "I want them to remember what Dean taught me," Marco said. "That the best gifts are the ones no one knows about. That true generosity doesn't need an audience. That the purpose of kindness is not to be thanked, but to create more kindness." He smiled, his eyes watery with age and memory. "For 30 years I watched Dean Martin give away his money to strangers. He never took credit. He never asked for recognition. He just wanted people to feel less alone on Christmas." Marco paused. "You know what I think about sometimes? I think about that stranger in 1944, the one who paid for Dean's meal when he was young and broke and ready to give up. That person never knew what they started. They never knew that their one small act of kindness would eventually feed 6,000 people. They never knew that Dean Martin would spend 30 years trying to repay a debt to someone whose name he never learned." He leaned forward. "That's the thing about kindness. You never know where it goes. You never know who it reaches. You throw it out into the world like a seed, and sometimes it grows into something you never imagined." Marco looked at the reporter one last time. "Whoever you are, the stranger who bought Dean Martin dinner in 1944, thank you. You probably died never knowing what you did. But because of you, 6,000 people had a warmer Christmas. Because of you, Dean Martin had a reason to believe in humanity. Because of you, I learned that one person can change the world, one meal at a time." He closed his eyes. "That's the miracle of Christmas, isn't it? Not the decorations or the presents or the songs. The miracle is that somewhere out there a stranger is thinking about you. A stranger wants you to be happy. A stranger paid for your dinner and asked for nothing in return." He opened his eyes and smiled. "Merry Christmas, from Dean Martin. From everyone who's alone tonight. From everyone who's ever been shown kindness by a stranger. Pass it on."